Hello, I'm Bill Loveless. Welcome to Platts Energy Week. The Obama administration is drawing close to unveiling one of the biggest environmental initiatives in U.S. history. The upcoming proposal by the Environmental Protection Agency will call for stringent new limits on carbon emissions from existing power plants. It's sure to prove controversial and sure to stir debate over how best to deal with greenhouse gas emissions. And one congressman thinks the best way is through a carbon tax. Maryland Representative John Delaney joins me now to share his view. Welcome to the program, Congressman.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here.
Congressman, you've just introduced a bill in the House.
Yes.
What would it do regarding a carbon tax, and why do you think it's timely now?
Sure. Well, it ties into what the president's doing, which, by the way, I think he's showing terrific leadership with the initiatives that are coming out. And I'm very excited for next week to see what the specific provisions are, because this is a generational challenge for us to deal with this issue. And I think the president's showing great leadership. And what we're trying to do is give states another tool, if you will, to deal with the problem. And the president is coming out with regulations through the EPA, which has limited scope in terms of what he can do. We'd like to give the states the ability to implement a carbon tax as an alternative to the regulations that are being put forth by the EPA. So an individual state will be able to follow the regulations that come from the EPA, or as an alternative, they'll be able to adopt a carbon tax, an excise tax on carbon, which I personally think, and many people agree, is a more effective and efficient way of actually changing behavior around carbon emissions, because it's a market-based solution.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, why is that?
Well, I have a view, as someone who comes from the private sector with a business background, is that markets are very powerful, and if you create the right financial incentives, industry will change very quickly. And I think most people agree, if we want to more meaningfully change kind of how we utilize carbon in this country, the ultimate way to do that is through a carbon tax.
So what scares people off on this proposition? Because it's a very controversial idea.
Yes.
There have been many proposals to do it on a national level.
That's right. And I'm in favor. The right answer is to do this on a national level. I think it would raise a lot of revenues. It would actually allow us to reallocate those revenues towards reducing taxes in other ways and making investments that we think are important. I'd rather tax something like carbon, which is bad for human beings, and not tax individuals and corporations as much, right? Those are some of the priorities that I would care about. But the reason I think people don't like a carbon tax is, one, there's the ideological bias. It's a tax, it's bad, right? So you have to get past that. People worry sometimes about the regressive nature of it, because it would disproportionately hurt poor people and lower-income Americans. Right. Now, there's lots of ways of dealing with that, and all of the thoughtful proposals have ways of mitigating that.
And that would be up to the states, I guess, because I think with this
That's
EPA reg, as the expectation is, it's going to give states some latitude in deciding how the emissions will be met.
But they can't provide they can't provide the kind of latitude we're providing in our bill. In other words, they're not allowed to say, you could have a carbon tax as an alternative. They don't quite have that range of power. So we're just trying to empower them, because I believe if they could, they would want this to be an option.
Well, you're a freshman Democrat in a House controlled by the Republican Party. What sort of feedback are you getting?
Very good, because it's a market-based solution. And most of what I've tried to do in my first term in Congress is work on solutions that are bipartisan. I've got a very significant piece of infrastructure legislation that has 31 House Republicans, 31 House Democrats, creates a large-scale infrastructure fund, but doesn't fund it by having the government put the money in, funds it by creating incentives for private companies to put the money in, and the incentive is tied to their ability to repatriate their overseas earnings. So it's a real market-based solution to a big problem, and that's what I'm trying to do with this issue. In other words, I'm trying to bring market forces to bear to deal with the problem of carbon emissions. And I think with what the EPA is going to announce next week, or the President's going to announce next week, what we're simply saying is states should have another option. They'll either follow the regulations, or they'll put in place a carbon tax.
Have you talked to any utilities?
Yeah, we've talked to, and that's what we're doing right now. We're kind of on a listening tour, talking to environmental groups, energy groups, private sector participants, and we're getting really good feedback.
Well, some utilities are in favor of it. If they're merchant and they see the and they have a lot of nuclear, like Exelon, this makes a lot of sense. But if you're utilities in other regions, especially with coal-fired generation, are concerned about these sorts of ideas.
Look at Exxon, right, the largest energy company in the world, last year disclosed in their annual financial statements modeling, when they make projections for their business, that one day there will be a tax on the social cost of carbon. That was a big announcement to my mind, because it shows that industry is assuming that one day we will tax carbon in some form or fashion. And I think industry is onto something here because they see what's happening. They know the best solutions are market-based solutions. They like market-based solutions because they're predictable and they're consistent with all the other kind of assumptions they have to make in their business, which are around markets. So I think if you go to most of the large corporations in this country, including most of the large utility and energy companies, they would be in favor of a market-based solution to deal with this problem, like a carbon tax.
Do you think that could this lead to a national
I think
tax
it could.
of some sort?
I think it
and
could.
Some would say that's opening the door, either a scary proposition or an opportunity.
Look, I think it's a huge opportunity because, again, the nice thing about a carbon tax is it creates a market-based solution.
Right.
And I think that accelerates behavior. Right? I think it's the most predictable way for industry and the private sector to deal with this issue because they understand the price and they can make investments and they can model it in, and it's the same kind of framework they apply to every other aspect of their business. And the nice thing about it is it raises revenues, which we could redeploy in a whole variety of ways, including by lowering corporate and individual taxes.
Yeah, and some, of course, worry how you might spend that money, too, right? I mean,
well, that's why most people think whatever we raise should go back to citizens so that it's revenue neutral is kind of the best practice.
Your bill would begin at $20 a metric ton, and then it would raise it 4% annually thereafter. How do you come up with that number?
Well, that's pretty consistent with what most people, I mean, that's below what most experts believe the social cost of carbon to be, which they think is in the low 30s now. But you have to leg into these things, right? So by escalating it about 4%, in 10 or 15 years, you get to about the right level. So that's a pretty normal that people have made about a carbon tax coming in at that level and then escalating over time. That's kind of a market-based approach.
Congressman, how's this playing in Maryland?
Very well. I mean, you know, I think a lot of people in Maryland are concerned about climate change. I think they understand that this is one of our great generational challenges. And so they applaud what the president's doing, and I think they applaud innovative ideas.
Would they support a carbon tax in the state of Maryland?
Would they? I think I think Maryland would clearly support having a carbon tax as an option to the EPA regulations, because that's what our bill does. Our bill does not mandate a carbon tax. Our bill simply says the states will have two options. They'll either adopt what the EPA has put forth, or they'll put in place a state-based carbon tax. So this is really a states' rights bill as well.
It's an interesting proposition. We need to leave it there. Congressman John Delaney from the state of Maryland and his proposal for a carbon tax. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Bill.
Coming up, a DOE program is looking to back new clean energy innovators. Could your company win?